Hi there, I'm Alan Nichols with the Canadian Expat, and I'm joined today with Paul Kurucz. Paul, welcome.
Hello, Alan. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining me. This is fantastic that you've been able to do this. Paul, you and I have known each other for how many years now?
It's about 5 or 6 years, I think.
Yeah, very close to that. It's fantastic to see you again. Now, one thing about Paul that anybody who's ever worked with him will know is that he is exceptionally passionate about helping people. And that's exactly what he does. Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Oh, thanks very much, Alan. And that is true. That is my passion. I originally started doing the kind of work that I do with Canadians when I was living over in Dubai. And when I moved back, I discovered that a whole bunch of people in Canada and from other countries really struggle to do the transition over to back home. And I put up a website detailing how to sort of step through a transition back home, everything from moving your home and your money. And as people started contacting me, I discovered I really liked helping people move back to Canada.
It's fantastic. It's certainly necessary. I mean, there are a lot of people that move abroad. We know that there's 2.8 million Canadians that live abroad. The average stay is, from what we've studied, is around 5 to 6 years. And then people come back. At that point, a lot of people need assistance. And Paul, you're the man to speak with.
Oh, thanks very much. I had a client this morning who expressed to me, he said, my company moved me to the States, a very long time ago. And he says, now that I have to come back, it's a completely different game. I've got all these things to do and I don't have a support system to do it in. And so I thought that was really kind of a nice quote to describe the challenge that many Canadians face when they want to move back.
So, in preparation for coming back to Canada, Paul, what do you think is the top four things that people really need to be cognizant of when they're ready to move back?
Well, I think that's a great one. If I was to give the top four things that they really need to be aware of, it would be number one, that life in Canada has changed since they've been abroad. And what that means, if it's just been to the States, then they've probably visited and they kind of get a sense of it. But I think it's a big shock to people when they come back and discover that real estate prices, for example, are dramatically different in most places in Canada now than they were even 5 or 7 years ago. So that would be a big one, is that there has been a lot of change in Canada. If you move to Toronto or Vancouver, I think you're going to find that it's larger, it's more diverse. And so it does kind of question for people, where do they want to move back? That would be a big one, is sort of getting a sense of that. Number two, obviously the logistics of moving back are a bit of a challenge. That can be everything from moving your home, your household goods. It can mean moving your money. It can be moving cars, etc. And then that's probably a bigger job than most people give credence for, particularly if they're moving from the States and they have a vehicle. The third thing that people, I think, should be aware of is that there are financial concerns. If you are coming from the States, you have to decide what to do with your 401k or your IRAs and how to move investments, and there are some complications with that. If you're moving from further abroad, you also have some questions. For example, I have a lot of clients from England who say, what do we do with our pensions? We can't move it, and how do we handle that? So that's kind of a third concern, which is that area. And I guess the fourth one is, if I was to put it in order, is the timing question. And that's one that people, I think, is probably the number one question I get, is how do we make this move happen sort of on a timeline, step by step, and do so in a way that really works for us and gets through all the chaos and the dislocation feelings in a way that makes it so that we're excited and we get to that end goal when we are finally arrive.
Sure. So tons of things to think about. It's an exciting process, and I know that you've got lots of stories. What are some of the most interesting things, or some of the more interesting circumstances that you've had to deal with when helping somebody relocate back to Canada?
Oh yeah, there's a couple of fun ones. I have a gentleman in California who actually had a rather large wine collection, and so he sent me a picture of a warehouse, a small warehouse, which was chilled, and inside it were 900 cases of wine. And he said, how do I move this to Canada? And I have to admit, I was a little floored. How do you move 900 cases of wine to Canada? And can you do that in a way that the liquor board here would allow? So when we got through that, I discovered that the cost of moving 900 cases by the time you pay taxes to the local provincial liquor board would be so exorbitant that it was kind of like, are you sure you really want to move 900 cases? And I think that was kind of a fun one there. Um, I have a client also who's over in Germany, and she wants to move a large number of parrots. And this is something that she's been working on for a while, so that's rather an interesting one as well. How do you move 16 parrots to Canada? So there's a couple of fun ones that I've had in the last little while, and it is a ton of fun working with my clients and helping them have a really smooth and confident transition back to Canada.
It's interesting that you mentioned the parrots. Of course, parrots is kind of unique, but pets of any sort, that's part of our family. But moving them from one country to another can be a challenge. Is it different for regulations if you're moving somebody with a dog, for example, from Japan or from Australia versus moving somebody with a cat from the United States? Is there a big difference when you're moving those sort of pets?
Yeah, great question, Alan, and I think that's one that concerns many people moving back. The place that I've had the biggest sort of challenge with is Australia, and the reason for that is because you can't do the flight in one hop. So Australian Airlines won't allow you to move a beloved feline or canine pet easily between them and Canada. So you would have to do it at two very long steps, and most airlines there just simply won't touch it. So I even have a client, unfortunately, in Australia where she decided, since her cat is elderly, that she would literally wait until the inevitable happens with her cat before she moves back. So that's the place where I think the biggest challenge. The rules in terms of moving a pet from Australia or United States or the UK are all the same. You need a simple veterinarian's certificate, and that certificate says that your beloved canine or feline or other pet is free of rabies. And that's about it. So in general, it's actually pretty easy to move a pet to Canada in terms of the regulations. The hard part then is logistics. So if you're moving from Hong Kong, it's actually a pretty straight flight. They go on in Hong Kong, they arrive in Vancouver, and your pet is fine. If you move from the States, bringing them over the border or by plane, again, works really well. It's the places that are really far away, like Australia, where you start to run into these problems.
Awesome. It's a big concern as a pet owner myself. I love my dog, and I would hate to think what it would take, sort of the toll that it would take on her to move her across the country. But I see, of course, we're in good hands with you at the helm. So here's something kind of to wrap things up a little bit, Paul. I don't want to take too much time from you today. What would the top 3 things that you would recommend to anybody that's preparing to come back to Canada? What would they do just to make sure that it's a seamless transition?
The number one thing I recommend, and this is for people who have lived abroad for a long time particularly, and that is come back and do a scouting trip. So that would be the first thing. Find out where you want to belong in Canada, where you fit in, where you'd like to go to. I think a lot of people assume that they'll go back to where they used to live before. If they're from Ottawa, they'll go back to Ottawa. If they're from Toronto, they'll go back to Toronto. And what they find is that when they left to go abroad, they were different people. They were at a different point in their life cycle. They have changed. Some of them are preparing to retire when they come back and they've been abroad. And all of a sudden they find that where they came from is no longer the place they want to go to. And a scouting trip to figure out where to go and just sort of get some of the groundwork set up would be the number one thing I could recommend that people do. Obviously, if you're coming from the States, it's easier to do that than if you're coming from further afield. But I think it's a very important step to do to really figure out where to come. The second one is to get your finances in order. And by that I mean if you again have pensions abroad, if you have investments abroad, etc., sort of figuring out how to move them back to Canada. If you're a Canadian who's living in the States, for example, the rules there say you cannot keep an investment account in the States. You actually have to move it to Canada. The brokers there are literally, assuming you're a Canadian and not a joint citizen, joint or dual citizen, then you actually get booted. So I unceremoniously got booted from an American investment account because, you're living in Canada, we can't serve you anymore. So there's little things like that, pensions, investments, and funds and that sort of thing. Sort of figure that out early in the game so that you don't end up with either a large tax bill or you end up with some financial logistics challenges. I guess the third thing that really concerns people, and this is one that I think is important and it's a good one to check out. If you have any health concerns, then please do plan ahead for how you're going to get health care in Canada. Some provinces have a 3-month wait before you can get on care, And so I'm having a lot of clients who do have perhaps medications. They plan ahead to have medications to cover them for their 3 months. And they also just sort of want a sort of bit more seamless transfer of care. And I think that's an important piece as well. So if you can think about your healthcare and that, well ahead of the time.
Awesome. Paul, thank you very much for joining me today. It's fantastic to see you again. What I'll do is I'll put your contact details in the description of the video. So anybody out there that's thinking about coming back, maybe they're faced with a situation that they have to come back, they'll be able to reach out with you easily.
Alan, thank you so much. And just like to make a little note that the work you do with the Canadian Expat Association is extremely valuable. And I'd like to thank you and your team there for the work that you're doing, because I know that it does help a ton of Canadians.
Thanks so much, Paul. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.